In it here now, what are you gonna do now? I'm gonna bid on here now. Who bid $500,000 bid?
Welcome to the Legacy of Agriculture. This program will explore the past, present, and future of agriculture. We'll look at the people, products, and events that have formed its history. And now, with today's guest, your host, Chris Bair.
Good morning, everybody. This is Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. We appreciate you joining us here on the Legacy of Agriculture show. I've got a great show planned out for this show and this broadcast. And coming and being my guest here today on the Legacy of Agriculture is a good friend and co-worker at one time, Mr. Scott Forke. Scott, thank you for joining us and being with us on the show today.
Morning, Chris.
You have moved from the flatland of the Midwest to up into the Rocky Mountains, and now I gotta go to the mountains to find you.
Yeah, we when I married my wife, and she was from Cody, Wyoming, 37 years ago. We had always, in fact, we got married here. We'd always had the kind of plan in the back of our minds to eventually move up here. And 8 years ago, it finally came to fruition and built a house and moved to Cody and semi-retired and living on a farm for the first time in my life. And so it's all good.
I have a soft spot in my heart for the Bighorn Basin, for the Lovell and Cody area. My grandparents, I have probably 3 or 4 generations of family that on my mother's side originally was from the Bighorn Basin, and my both of my grandparents on my mom's side is buried outside of Lovell, Wyoming, and so I have a big soft spot there. For Wyoming. Absolutely beautiful basin, and Cody's a wonderful town.
Yeah, it's a gorgeous area. There's never-ending things to do up here. People are just fantastic, and it's kind of one of those places you got to want to get here to come here. It's
Yeah,
kind of out of the way, but we do have a tourist season, and that's when I stay away from town. Yeah, Cody's a great place.
so your family has a absolutely amazing story about being in the auction business, multi-generational family in the auction industry on the industrial side, and a very interesting story. Tell us about your family and inception into the construction ag world many decades ago.
Yeah, yeah. So the story with Forkey Brothers was when my grandfather and his brother were growing up on a farm out north of Lincoln, Nebraska. They had for some reason they got it stuck in their head that they wanted to be an auctioneer. And growing up, they went to a lot of auctions. They practiced auctioneering behind the barn while they were growing up. And then it around the late teens, they finally formalized an idea to start this auction company and formed Forkey Brothers in 1921. And the basis, the foundation of the whole business was based on an absolute auction. In other words, nobody could bid on their own equipment or own assets. Nobody could buy anything back. It was a legitimate above board auction from the get go. And it was a little bit novel at the time, and they had a little bit of a hard time getting some traction. Did a lot of farm sales, household goods, whatever they could come up with, and started their auction business. And then the Depression hit, and in the late 20s, they had a real struggle, and because everybody was struggling. And then all of a sudden, the banks realized, hey, Forkey Brothers are the only ones that are actually selling assets because of the absolute nature of the auction. And they got a lot of traction during the Depression simply because they were able to convert assets for distressed situations. Not that that was the only business that they were in, but there was a lot of distressed auction business going on at the time. They developed an even better reputation with everybody for being a high integrity, absolute auction business, and really developed quite a following, started doing sales not only in Nebraska, but outside of Nebraska, and became pretty successful locally. Then after World War II, the second generation got back from the war. My dad was in the Philippines. My uncles were in the European theater, and after the war, they came back and were looking for things to do. And one of them joined up. Avery, my uncle, joined up first, and then eventually his brother Dean and my dad joined the firm. And at some point, right after World War II, during that reformulation of the business and family members coming into it, a contractor's widow approached an attorney in Lincoln, and the guy had been tragically killed. And so the widow had this construction company. She didn't know what to do with it. The attorneys approached our company and said, would you think about having a construction equipment auction? And they thought about it and thought maybe they could do a pretty good job, and had the sale. It was an amazing sale for that period of time, in that people came not only from the local area, but people came from several states around Nebraska to this little auction, and had a tremendous impact on the idea that people would come from further away than 50 or 100 miles to come to an auction. Of course, they were selling equipment that was attractive to a bigger audience. And that sale led to another construction equipment sale, and that sale led to another one. And all of a sudden, they're doing auctions in different states of construction equipment, started developing a reputation for, again, an absolute auction of construction equipment. Very, very successful. Excuse me. And all of a sudden, the what I called the pots and pans auction business became less attractive. They started doing a lot of construction company auctions around the country. Because of my background, my dad's background, being a pilot in the Army Air Force, and my uncle Dean being a pilot, they decided, in order to make it more convenient to travel around the country, they bought their first plane. They started flying around the country to do auctions, and eventually they had done auctions in almost every state in the country and province of Canada. By the late 60s, early 70s, they were really a force in the construction equipment auction business, and they basically pioneered that business. So
how could I work for you for so many years and not know this story? This is an amazing story, Scott. So,
I have no idea. Maybe I told you about it, and you were thinking about other things at the time.
I could have. Folks, we're down to the end of our first segment of the Legacy of Agriculture. Good friend and co-worker from years ago has joined us here on the show, and appreciate Scott for joining us. We'll be right back in segment number 2.
Hi, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction Realty and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pifers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pifers. Nobody does it better.
Good morning, everybody. This is Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. We're back in our second segment with Scott Forke from the formerly known auction company Forke Brothers that was based out of Lincoln, Nebraska, well over 100 years ago. And Scott has joined me from his semi-retirement home in the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming to join us on the show this morning, and has told an absolutely amazing story about his grandfather and his brother that started an auction company clear back in the late 19 teens or into the 1920s, doing pots and pans auctions and agricultural auctions that eventually integrated into post-World War II, of having their first big construction auction and your first big break in the auction industry, and was very well respected because of the integrity of the types of auctions that you were doing. Tell me a little bit more about your philosophy as an auction company and the integrity that went into the auction business, Scott.
Yes, it was a little unusual in that most auction companies were selling with reserve, so that if an asset didn't bring a certain price point, the owner could decline the sale. There were also even less scrupulous situations where the owners would bid on their own assets, run up the bid, have shills in the crowd, have an uncle or a cousin or somebody in there bidding on their behalf. And Forky Brothers just didn't allow any of that. In fact, if we caught somebody, we'd kick them off the auction site. And we developed a really good reputation for people that otherwise might not come to an auction or have some skepticism about the whole environment of an auction, because they knew that it was going to be a straight up above board transaction. And particularly when we got in the construction world, that was extremely important because the decisions were of a potential buyer making a decision to jump on an airplane, fly halfway across the country to attend an auction, and they didn't want to be manipulated. They didn't want to be given the runaround. And knowing that we ran a straight up auction, we got tremendous crowds, tremendous participation, and people from all over the country and eventually all over the world would come to the auctions because they knew at the end of the day everything changed ownership, changed hands, and everybody had the same legitimate chance to bid on and potentially buy the assets, with no reserves, no floor, no minimums. It was very attractive. And the other side of the coin was, with that philosophy, those became true market prices. They weren't manipulated prices. They were legitimate, above board. At the end of the day, the hammer dropped. The ownership changed hands from the owner to a new buyer. We also developed a market book called the Blue Book, which and we advertised and sold a lot of blue books. It became the market guide for the construction industry at the time, because it presented actual sale prices for everything that we sold. It became the Bible for a lot of lawyers and bankers, and of course the construction world, because if they had assets, they wanted to know a value, they could pick up a blue book and take a look at it and hunt down what the actual current market value of those assets were. And we were kind of, again, a pioneer in the whole asset valuation segment of the business, and by publishing a market guide that had legitimate true sale values of, specifically construction equipment, but it ran the gamut from everything from road construction to bridge construction, crushing, asphalt paving, concrete plants, cranes, lift equipment. We still sold a fair amount of farm equipment, but it was normally in conjunction with construction. So, finished landscaping, things like that. And that Blue Book became a guide and a Bible for a lot of people trying to find market values.
Not only that, but people who are in the valuation business or even in the appraisal business, when you take an auction value that's based on a truly unreserved, uninhibited auction, um, a judge isn't going to argue about value when it comes to an unreserved auction for sure. But the other thing that for our younger listening portion of our listening audience is that back in the time that you were talking about in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, there was no internet. It was you go and buy, that became the encyclopedia, that became the Google of auction values. Now I can tell you that most of the valuations that we do as an auction company, Scott, and you know this, um, is as I get out my computer and I go out to the various sources, and there is some phenomenal resources out there for evaluating entire fleets of machinery.
Yes, yeah. Uh, I I am now in the appraisal business and appraise a lot of construction equipment, and there's tremendous resources online to find the same information. With the caution that the only difficulty is finding true transacted values. On the retail side, you can find what people are asking for equipment, and that runs the gamut from dealers to individual owners. On the auction side, because of the number and variety of auction companies out there, yeah, there's a lot of publications of auction transacted values. But again, with the amount of reserve auctions and that sort of thing, it's more difficult to do the research to find out what's truly legitimately transacted, both on the retail side and the auction side. So we have to do a bit of deep dive analysis to find out what's up in a lot of that value publication that's out there online.
Yeah. And I want to go back. I want to go back to your family's history post World War II. You had family members that had served in the military, had served in World War II, served and served our country honorably and very well. And thank your family for that. But I can remember many years ago when we worked together on the agricultural side here in the United States, there was a lot of conversation about the integrity of the auction and how we put auctions together. And I remember having those conversations, and that stuck with me for all of these years. And Forkey Brothers really was in the construction world the standard for the auction industry for many years.
Yes, I they kind of pioneered the business, and a lot of people wanted to get into it. Eventually, got into it. It's not like we didn't have a lot of competition out there, and there was always innovation and again with some of the big companies out there now with developing auction yards, for example, for bringing in consignments from a variety of sellers. The whole online thing, you're absolutely right. The whole online revolution has changed the auction business to something that I wouldn't have recognized 20 years ago.
That's it. Well,
And not
it
that I don't miss the good old days, but you're right. Before there was an online auction, you had to go to the auction to bid, and
yes.
now there's a whole evolution of the auction business where the old days of the auction almost being a social event where people would come from all over and rub elbows and see their friends and have a cup of coffee or a sandwich and catch up on the world. And then, it was the little microcosm of the marketplace. But it was a social event as well as an auction. And I think a lot of that online stuff is kind of done away with. What I really enjoyed about the auction business was the whole social aspect of it.
Yes.
People meeting up with each other and friends commiserating and comparing notes and that sort of thing. You can't do that on a computer screen. So,
Yep.
yeah.
Folks, we're going to be right back. This is the end of segment 2, and we're going to be right back in segment 3.
Hey, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction Realty and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffer's.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffer's. Nobody does it better.
Folks, we're back with the Legacy of Agriculture. I'm your host, Chris Bair. Scott Forke has joined me from the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming this morning as my guest. We've had a great conversation about the inception of Forke Brothers clear back in the late 19 teens. I guess that's the right way to say it, or the early 1920s.
Yep.
And his grandfather started, and Scott was a third generation auctioneer and an auction producer, I should say. The auction industry, and you touched just a little bit on it on the end of segment 2, Scott. And I don't want to take away your thunder, but the auction business has changed substantially from a technology standpoint. Is that all of the clerking, the cashiering, the bidder registration, the mailing out of the flyers and the publication was all done by hand. There was nothing done electronically. It was old school.
Yeah. I remember carrying a typewriter around, flying around the country and typing up equipment cards. So yeah, it was pretty old fashioned. Yeah.
Now I've never
Yeah, we all had typewriters. That was pre-computers.
Are you kidding? Now I've never heard that you used typewriters back there, and you were using the typewriter to do the listings, the auction listings.
Do the listings, the blue book. We would put for example, the blue books, type a 3x5 card with the description of the equipment and what it sold for, and then we had a card catalog, card file that we'd file all those things in categories, and then I'd haul the big file drawers down to the printer, and they would manually type those into a typesetter, and that's how they printed up the book. I mean, yeah, I was pretty. Computers have revolutionized a lot of things in the last 40, 50 years. So
Every time I think that I've heard it all, I learned something new. I would have, when I got in the auction business in the early 1990s, we were still using the tear tickets and doing a lot of stuff by hand, but at least we had a computer to type a lot of that stuff in. And my mind's never gone back another 2 decades to thinking in order to make it look right, you had to use a typewriter.
Oh, well, the original process was, we had a clerk in the field that would handwrite the bidder number and the selling price, and then every 6 or 7, 8 items, the clerk sheet would run into the office. And when I was a kid, they called it shagging sheets. I would shag the clerk sheet into the office so they could start preparing the invoices, and the invoices were all handwritten. And I remember our girls would they'd tape up their fingers, because by the end of the day, their fingers were just blistered from handwriting all those invoices in triplicate. And
Wow.
so when the customers came in to settle, they had an accurate, completed invoice, and it was all handwritten.
No, I'm gonna go off the road and into the ditch just a little bit. I bought a tractor here about a year ago. A good friend of mine, and it was an Oliver tractor, and you can go back to the Floyd County Museum in Eastern Iowa, and in that museum, Oliver gave all of their records to this museum, and they got it in archives. And I wanted to know the build codes in that tractor. And they actually, I think it cost me like $35 or $50 or something. They sent me a copy of the ledger sheet, and all of the options for all of that particular model of tractor were handwritten. And it was
Mm.
obviously a woman's writing because it was absolutely beautiful handwriting, and it was all handwritten. So, anyways, we we just dated ourselves, Scott, as to how
Yeah.
old we are, and but however, that type of stuff is so interesting because take my children for example. I don't think that they know that stuff. And I tell them, say, I'm getting old enough to know better, and I tell my kids that. But that's really neat that you shared that with us. That
Yeah.
really is some low hanging fruit.
Yeah,
So
I've got boxes of old ledgers and stuff up in the attic that go way back. It's interesting to break them out every once in a while. Even old sale bills back from the 20s and 30s that are just, I mean, if you look at technology, the farm equipment in the 20s and 30s compared to today, or the construction equipment in the last 40, 50 years, everything is just phenomenal how much things have changed.
I just want you to know that I'm going to jump in my pickup, and now I'm going to keep my commitment to come see you and your wife in Wyoming, because I want to see sale bills that were printed back in the 20s and 30s. I would love to see some of that history. I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, they're pretty cool. Yeah. Yeah,
So
fortunately, my dad put a little portfolio together way back in the day and saved all that stuff, or it would all been gone because all that stuff is, you call it consumable sale bills. You throw them away at the end of the day. So, yeah,
yeah, nobody wants to store them for well 100 years now. I mean,
yeah.
we're
Yeah.
2024. It's over 100 years now. So
They,
what's your favorite memory, Scott, of all the years that you were in the auction industry? What's your favorite memory?
the camaraderie and the legacy of the family business. Finally, I grew up in the summers. I'd fly around the country with my dad and the auction crew and do what little I could do as a kid, running sheets and stuff like that. But I got a good taste of the auction business. When I graduated college, I had no interest in the auction business. I wanted to do my own thing. Eventually, a recession hit and I needed a job. And I approached my dad and said, I need something to do. And 6 months after I joined the firm, I never looked back. I just absolutely loved it. Growing up, my dad was gone 80% of the time on the road, so I didn't get to know my dad real well. Once I joined the firm, I was with my dad 24/7, driving and flying around the country, and really got caught up not only with my dad but with my other family members. And it was a real team effort, an amazing learning experience. And so that would probably be my favorite memory. The other things we did such a variety of auctions and such a variety of places, just traveling around the country and seeing different, quote unquote cultures from the deep south to the northwest and New England area. This country's big and very diversified, lots of different interesting parts of the country to go and visit. And then you get the other thing that was really fascinating and enjoyable was getting to know the customers, our selling customers and the buyers, but mainly the stories of people that grew up in the industry, and a lot of them started out with basically a shovel and a wheelbarrow or a pickup truck and a small machine, and built multi-million dollar companies out of them. The stories of people starting out with nothing, and particularly after World War II, starting a business and watching it grow and develop, and the success stories were tremendous. Most of our auctions at the time, and my growing up in the business, were retirement liquidations of people just decided that they didn't have anybody to hand the company to. They got tired of the business, wanted to go fishing or hunting or start and enjoy life. And the easiest way to liquidate a company was to just have an auction. And we were getting pretty much retail values for most of the stuff we were selling. So it became the norm for the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s for somebody that had decided they wanted to retire, to have a blowout auction. And when we'd have one of those, the pricing and the values and everything were just incredible. That was our bread and butter. Those were the most exciting sales that we did. And then the variety was, we'd do underground mining equipment. We liquidated Eastern Airlines when they went bankrupt. Trying to think of tunnel boring machine companies that, tunnel bored big tunnels under. The one company I remember was they tunneled all the way underneath Detroit, Michigan, for a
Really?
sewer system. And we sold all the equipment, big projects that would, at the conclusion of a big dam project or a big road construction project, and particularly joint ventures, the solution to liquidating a joint venture was to sell all the assets and split the proceeds from the sale to help liquidate the joint venture. We did a lot of that kind of work. And so my life in the auction business was just a learning curve all the time. I was always learning something. And that was probably another one of the biggest enjoyments in life I had, was that just every project was exciting and a big learning curve, and getting to know the owner and the situation. And I gained a lot of knowledge from the business.
Hey, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction Realty and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffer's.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffer's. Nobody does it better.
You One of the things that you talked about in the earlier segment, Scott, was being gone from home. Your dad was gone so much of the time. How did you balance your family time and your family life with work? And I know that your children are raised and gone, and you just you got your first grandchild not too long ago. And how did you balance your family life? You have a wonderful family.
Um, when I was home, I was home. So I didn't golf, I didn't hunt, I didn't fish. I spent all my time with my kids. That was compensation for being on the road 70, 80% of the time. Yeah, the year that we did the Eastern Airlines project and I headed up the whole project, it was a 6-day auction in 3 states, Florida, Georgia, and California. At the end of the year, I looked at the calendar, or it wasn't even the end of the year, it was like September. I had been gone 221 days. So I was on the road almost 300 days that year. And yeah, when you're home, you got to be home.
There's no such thing as PTO in the auction business, is there?
It's the extreme of 24/7, 365. When you I remember a lot of times coming home on Christmas Eve, or running, getting from the airport to run into a room to have Thanksgiving dinner. So yeah.
Yeah, sometimes you got to leave on Christmas afternoon to get to the next project, and a lot of
Yeah.
people don't understand that about the
Yeah,
auction industry.
I don't know how many New Year's Eves I spent in a hotel room someplace.
That's right. Well, in the auction industry, you have to be dedicated to the business, and you also have to be dedicated to your family in order to have that family work balance. That's critically important. And Forky Brothers eventually grew to the point that you were required.
Yes, we started having some stress in our business formation because several of the older partners wanted to retire. The younger guys didn't have the capital to come up with a buyout type of a situation. We ended up looking for a venture capital group. We talked to Mirabini and a couple other guys, and eventually a couple of Caterpillar dealers approached us, had heard that we were looking for a venture capital, and approached us and said, "We not only want to invest, we want to buy the company, and we want Caterpillar to be involved in the business going forward." So we negotiated with a couple of Caterpillar dealers, sold the company, and they wanted to grow it. We went international. I ended up opening up an office over in the Netherlands. Had a business partner over there. Moved the family to The Hague. Started having auctions in Europe. The Southeast Pacific market crashed, so all of a sudden I'm flying around the world picking up pieces of equipment from everywhere from Bangkok to New Delhi to bring to the auction over in Europe. We were bringing equipment in from overseas. The market really changed in that it became in the process of developing the business a global operation. And this equipment, as it became more expensive and more sophisticated, had the potential to get put on a boat and shipped around anywhere.
Right.
And then the other fascinating story I remember was eventually the Caterpillar dealer sold our company to Ritchie Brothers, and we went to work for Ritchie Brothers. I was moved to Denver, and then they wanted to do an online auction, and they built a computer system to do online transactions because that was the new thing. And I'll never forget, we finally set up the system, had it all a go. It was managed from up in Vancouver. We turned on the system, the auction began, and we were in, I think, selling concrete trucks or something. And the auctioneers bidding away, and all of a sudden, at the time, the system was if the management up in Vancouver, if they got a bid on the computer screen, they'd yell into a microphone, go through the telephone wire, and the speaker in the auctioneer's booth would hear a yip.
Yep.
And that was a
Right.
bid for the online thing. So the speaker starts yipping. I had a guy from the Denver Post there because they were writing up a story on this online auction business.
Hey,
Yeah.
Scott.
Yep.
Scott, I'm gonna we're gonna continue this in just a few minutes, but we're actually to the end of our radio show here at WNX Radio, and want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Piper Auction and Realty. We are actually going to continue the show and on our Apple, Spotify, and YouTube video channels. So we're in a very brisk conversation about Forky Brothers and the acquisition and the sale of Forky Brothers, and we're going to continue this on social media. So join us there at the legacyofagriculture.com, and we're just going to keep going.
Hey, this is Jasmine at Piper's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Piper's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pifers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pifers. Nobody does it better.
As we continue on with the show, now we don't now that we're off from the radio portion of it, we could just go uninhibited. So you had a writer from the Denver Post that was listening to his first, what we always coined in the auction business, the first electronic green man.
Yeah. He so anyway, to get back to the story, uh, I was hauling this reporter around from the Denver Post on the auction side. I showed him all the facilities and stuff, and he was a young kid and he wasn't really interested in the auction at all. But as soon as we said this, the first time we're doing an live online auction, his ears perked up and he got kind of interested. And So eventually I haul him into the auctioneer's booth. And like I said in the last segment, the technique at the management style at the time was we had people up in Vancouver that were watching computer screens, and whenever they got a bid online, they would yell into the telephone, just yip, and it would telegraph into the auctioneer's booth wherever it was. Richie had, I think, 40 facilities at that time. Anyway, this particular auction, it was in Denver, so they're getting bids for the Denver auction. In the auctioneer's booth with the guy from the Denver Post, all of a sudden the speaker's getting these bids coming in. Yip, yip, yip. And we were selling these junky old concrete trucks. It wasn't that big deal. But anyway, the crowd's bidding, the online speakers going off, and finally the auctioneer runs out of bidders, and the online buyer is successful, and the auctioneer says sold to, and across the speaker, the guy up in Vancouver said sold to American Samoa.
American Samoa.
And I looked at the guy from the Denver Post. The auctioneer's looking at me. We're all looking at each other. Where in the hell is American Samoa? It turns out it's a little island out in the Pacific. And
Really?
everybody just lit up going, this revolutionizes our ability to access buyers, because of, the visualization was of some guy in a grass hut with a laptop hitting his button on an island someplace, and
Right.
having a legitimate opportunity to buy in Denver or Colorado is the guy sitting in the crowd.
I would venture to guess that that bidder from America Samoa was probably just as surprised as everybody else was in the world.
So yeah, his big problem is then he has to figure out how to get that truck on a boat and ship it to American Samoa.
But
But
you think about that bidder though, Scott. Is here you've got a guy from American Samoa that probably has two cement trucks on the whole island. He just bought a cement truck in the United States, and he's probably the hero of the island.
could be, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
so my preceding experience with having auctions, and even over in Europe, and then working with Ritchie Brothers and that sort of thing. Yeah, again, if the buyer wanted to come to the sale, they had to jump on a plane. If they were in Australia and they wanted to come to an auction, they had to jump on a plane and fly in and physically bid on the equipment. So all of a sudden, this just opened up a wide variety of opportunities for people. All of a sudden, they didn't need to physically travel around the world to go to auctions. They could just open up their computer and register and bid online. And
So
it, it was really wonderful in a lot of ways, just because it opened up a whole new market world. Uh,
your live bidders that had been coming to your auctions for decades and sitting in the theater or sitting in the crowd, bidding and buying, all of a sudden technology has changed the face of the auction industry. And how palatable was it to those bidders that were really didn't but I guess I'm talking about the naysayers. The guys said, "Well, they really don't have a bidder." How did you manage that?
it was tough. There was a lot of skepticism. There was a lot of sort of finger pointing, and anything with technology is a little bit smoke and mirrors. And there's a lot of potential for sort of bad things to happen because of the fact that, again, in the old days, you could eyeball the guy that was bidding against you. You knew who was bidding against you. With an online auction, you really don't know. And I think there are a lot of auction companies out there that have kind of redeveloped the old shill method of bidding. If need to manipulate the bid, they'll just have somebody get it on the computer or whatever. So there was a lot of skepticism. Again, the only way that Forky Brothers, Ritchie Brothers, anybody uh, could dispel the rumor mill and allay people's fears that there was something dishonest going on was to show records. And we also recorded all the online bidding and did a pretty sophisticated method. And again, if we ever got in trouble and we needed a record to show that it was a legitimate sale, we had those recorded records. And yeah, we had people storm into the auction booth and get, I was bidding and all of a sudden it sold online, and we just pull them into an office, transfer the records, show them where the bids were coming from, show them the transacted value and who bought it, and say, go call Joe over in Australia. He's the one that bought it.
Yeah.
And that would alleviate the dispute most of the time.
I would like to go down the technology road with you and auctions and technology and I was cut from the cloth long before technology became a huge player in the auction industry. But over the last 15 to 17 years, with the online bidding platform, the simulcast bidding platform, accompanied with the live auctioneer, I'm 110% believer, and I don't think I will ever change my mind that technology should never replace the auctioneer. That technology should complement the auction process and should complement the auctioneer, not replace him. What's your feelings there, Scott?
Well, I can tell you we had a lot of high paid auctioneers that were thinking they might be out of a job eventually. And I love the skill and the technique of a good auctioneer is just amazing. We had one back in Forky Brothers days. It was probably the best auctioneer I ever knew, and he could actually get. I mean, his one of his things was he'd get to go in auctioneering and he'd start bouncing on the balls of his feet. And I was clerking a lot of times, and I'd look out in the crowd, and everybody's bouncing along with him. He was in a cadence, and he was bouncing, and the crowd is bouncing around, and they're kind of into it. And he could mesmerize people with his voice and get them captivated with the auction. And you can't emulate that any other way. And he could pull bids out of people just because they get in that groove, that not competitive. I'm not going to let that other guy buy the thing.
It's just
And you've been there, Chris. You know that.
it at that point, it's not a monetary transaction. It's almost an emotional transaction of this we're now in the Super Bowl and I'm going to win the Super Bowl at all costs.
Yeah, and I'm the worst victim. I mean, my wife and I have gone to auctions and not construction equipment, but different things, and I get caught in the same thing. Well,
Yeah.
I want that. I'm going to get that, and yeah, you get caught up in the moment, and then afterwards you have buyer's remorse, is what they call it. You go, yeah. The good news is I bought it. The bad news is I probably paid way too much for it.
Uh,
But,
yeah, what one of the things that always amazed me about the live auctioneer, and it wasn't until I worked for Ritchie Brothers and was working with you on your team, but um, I was ringing at an auction, and of course the auction industry has become a world market, but I was listening to an auctioneer, and all of a sudden, the auctioneer, not only was he saying the numbers in English, but he was also speaking the numbers in other languages, especially Spanish. And so he'd say the number in English and the number in Spanish, mostly for the buyers that were coming from Mexico. And I was completely mesmerized by those bilingual auctioneers. I didn't know there was such a thing as a bilingual auctioneer.
yes, we had several of them. And particularly in countries where the language thing was a pride factor, you had to be spit out the numbers in bilingual fashion, like the Ritchie Brothers sales in France. The French are very proud of their language, so you do it in English and French.
Yeah.
Uh, and the other thing that they innovated was they called it the bid board, which would convert the local currency into American dollars. So we always sold in US dollars, but we had a digital board that was pegged to the daily rate, exchange rate, so that buyers in the local currency could know what they were bidding in local currency. So the auctioneer was always auctioning in US dollars, but they could see, oh yeah, but that converts to so many francs or so many Deutschmarks, or now it's euros.
Right.
At the time, there was, when I was over in Europe, there was still, every country had its own currency, and the currencies were fluctuating every day. So it was very, very difficult for people in different countries to understand, and with the rapidity, the speed of the auction, trying to calculate in their mind, well, I'm bidding in dollars, but what am I actually paying for this thing? So the bid board worked very, very well for those situations as well. Yeah, you get into different countries and different language issues and that sort of thing. The auction business becomes a lot more complex.
And it's complex for an out of country bidder too, because if an out of country bidder buys a Caterpillar dozer, he's got to convert his money. He's got to go through customs. There's emissions that he has to go through. So it's not always just a cut and dried, easy business for sure. There's a
Yeah,
lot of moving parts that goes into these auctions. But I want to talk as we continue and go down the technology paths, Scott, is as I remember 15, 17 years ago when the online only bidding platform, the technology had become advanced. I was hardcore live auctions, loved them, and I had the opportunity to join up on an online only auction platform. And my first reaction to the online only platform was no, absolutely not. That's ridiculous. Nobody's going to bid on an online only platform. And the gentleman that was wanting to hire me to come to work for me, he says, "Well, just take a look at it." And I says, I said, "Send me a half a dozen of your online bidders that have bid online only, and I'd like to call them, and I would like to visit with them and have their experience." And the thing that we learned very, very quickly was is that people absolutely love that technology. They love the ability to sit in their office in a blizzard and be able to bid on a combine or a piece of equipment a long ways away from them and never leave their office and never leave home. And so the technology and now the speed and the rate and what people can bid and buy online is truly remarkable.
yeah. There were a couple things early on that were difficult. Number one was the stability of the platform. And Ritchie Brothers spent a ton of money developing their own system. There were others out there, but the worst case scenario was the system would crash,
Yep.
and those buyers that decided not to come to the auction were out of luck.
Yes.
And so a lot of times they'd just stop the auction. All of a sudden, technology guys are flying around the room trying to fix whatever the problem was, try to get the system back up and running. But yeah, there were some big interruptions, and it all had to do with the stability of the platform itself. And I remember several times where early on, the early iterations of it, where these people didn't trust the system because of the stability standpoint. I'd have customers. I remember a sale in Virginia, a big coal mine, and one of my good customers in Australia called me up, and before the auction, he said, I'm really nervous. I absolutely have to have this machine. and can I call you? And you can relay the bid over the cell phone. I said, yeah, we can do that. You can go online or what. He said, I'll go online, but I'm still going to call you. And sure enough, he called me up about 5 minutes before the machine. We chatted and shot the breeze for a while, and the machine came up. And sure enough, the system crashed about the time that his machine,
Oh,
and it was in the middle of the sale. And there are a lot of people that from around that region that were not about to stop the auction while the technology came back on. And fortunately, the guy in Australia was on the phone, and I bid for him. He bought the machine. But there were, how many bidders did we lose, and what did that compromise the value of the machine,
right,
compromise the value of that asset? And that was a real dangerous thing, because again, the seller's relying on not only the integrity of the auction, but all of a sudden they're relying on the stability of the system.
right.
And there were some times where we got sellers that were very pissed off because they got caught in a situation where the system crashed, and all of a sudden you're relying on a lot less bidders to bid on the same stuff. So was it a legitimate sale? Was it legitimate value? Because you lost all of a sudden. Back in the old days, everybody was live. There was no risk of losing bidders, but with the technology thing, if the technology went down, you lost a certain percentage of potential buyers, and that was
Right.
dangerous.
Yeah.
So
Very, very, very much so. But anyways, well, Scott, there's so many wonderful stories about the auction industry, and I suppose that that's one of the many reasons that I do the legacy of agriculture. Um, Unfortunately, I have to get back to my real job and earn real money, and so I just want to thank you very much for joining us. This has been a great show, and it's been so informative. But before we go, I know that you're in the appraisal business, and I know that a lot of our listeners are looking for appraisals. Do you mind giving out your information about how they can get a hold of you for an appraisal?
sure, yeah. My company name is Forke and Tool, Tuel Appraisal Services. My email is probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. Is very simple. It's sforke, Forke, at gmail.com. And we do appraisals of everything that has an engine, tires, tracks, anything industrial. We also belong to an appraisal association. So if there are, for example, food processing equipment and things that are beyond my skill level and knowledge, we belong to an appraisal association that has specialization guys that delve into all sorts of different assets. So if we can't do it, I can certainly lead whoever is interested to a good potential appraisal company to do their appraisal. And we do the gamut from everything from company mergers, acquisitions. We do a little bit of bankruptcy stuff. But most of what we do are appraisals for example, partnerships or something that a company that needs an annual evaluation for banking, for insurance, for bonding purposes. So most of our clients are repeat customers. They're ongoing businesses. We have settled family disputes and divorces and all sorts of things. But that's a minor portion of what we do. Most of it is just somebody wants to know what their company's worth today.
Sure, absolutely. Well, Scott, thank you very much for joining us, and I will definitely see you on the road.
Sounds good, Chris.
Okay.
Thanks.
In it here now, I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna been on here now, who bid $500,000 bid.
We hope you've enjoyed today's edition of The Legacy of Agriculture with Chris Bair, sponsored by Pfeiffer's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Call Pfeiffer's at 605 836 2277.